Serious, what are some of the creepiest declassified documents made available to the public? I think the most important thing to come out of the recently redacted Kennedy files is verifiable proof that Ruby knew Oswald before the assassination. That's been debated, covered up for decades. Sweden had a compulsory sterilization program. Wikipedia. Wiki compulsory sterilization in Sweden, running from 1935 to 1979. It was state sanctioned and given without consent, sometimes without the people knowing they were being sterilized. The three main reasons for these sterilizations were 1. Health concerns for the mother. 2. Eugenic, not wanting to pass on mental illnesses or any form of handicap. 3. Social, antisocial people, criminals, drunks, etc. Close bracket. In other words, anyone who didn't conform properly and was considered unfit to raise children. Not really classified, but very creepy. The business plot of 1933. The wealthiest businessmen of America, like the names you see on banks and buildings in America today, allegedly formed a plot to overthrow President FDR and install a military leader in his place. Their choice was a U.S. Marine general named Smedley Butler, as he was a decorated leader of the highest rank. Butler, a loyal patriot, played along until they were seriously about to attempt to collapse the U.S. economy by holding the financial stability of the country hostage. He rolled on them and testified to Congress about the planned coup. No one was prosecuted. General Smedley Butler may be the reason the world does not officially have a society like the United Corporations of Rockefeller, Morgan and Chase. Source: had an activist U.S. Gov professor. I remember a US government funded project that involved teaching dolphins how to talk that ended up with 2 female scientists giving them hand jobs. Probably the nth country experiment, performed by Lawrence Radiation Lab in the 1960s. The gist is that 3 newly graduated physics PhDs with no weapons experience, only 2 of whom were working at a given time, were tasked to design a nuclear weapon without access to classified materials. That is, no existing nuclear weapons designs or weapon-focused supporting materials, and with only basic computational support. It took about 2.5 years of part-time work to come up with a workable design of the more challenging Fat Man type. Understandably, the final design and a whole lot of details remain redacted from the public version. The takeaway: difficulty of design is not the limiting factor in a country developing a nuclear arsenal. Not by a long shot. It's so easy, a couple new physicists could do it in a couple years back before modern computational methods. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. It's incredibly hard to find Dahmer's confession online without it being behind a paywall, but it is in the public domain, so I've provided link to the PDF downloads. The first 63 pages are mainly forms and letters. The real meat of the confession starts afterwards. Part 1. HTTP, Justice of Freedom. Milwaukee Confession 1. PDF. Part 2. HTTP, Justice of Freedom. Milwaukee Confession 2. PDF. Definitely the Jonestown death tape. That sheet proves to be a solid way to lose all chances of sleep. So, here's some context. Jim Jones started a cult called the People's Temple, yes, without the apostrophe, and eventually they moved to a new settlement they built in Guyana called Jonestown, named after their leader, since he made them believe he was some form of the Messiah, as a lot of cult leaders did. He could control them all to do whatever he pleases, and one of the things they did was practice drinking Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid as commonly believed, to prepare themselves for the time when they commit revolutionary suicide. These practices were just normal Flavor Aid Kool-Aid, but Jones told them it was poison just to see their reactions. When the time came, someone recorded what was, essentially, the sounds of people drinking Flavor Aid laced with cyanide, alongside a fatal cocktail of other substances, many victims including young children, which you could hear screaming in the audio. 900 or so people died, only a few didn't. This was the biggest loss of American life in a deliberate act until 911, and there is an audio recording of it. And just a very strong reminder, this wasn't mass suicide, this was mass murder. Many people were willing to die at his hands, but all the children and some of the adults didn't. Since all of them were forced to take the drink, it wasn't their own choice to drink it, it was Jones's. So, whilst people believe that it was a suicide, they were all duped into being murdered by Jim Jones. Edit. Fix the largest loss of American life fact to add in a deliberate act, and talked a bit more about how it was mass murder, not mass suicide. Operation Northwoods. Wikipedia. Org Wiki. Operation Northwoods. Basically, the U.S. government was going to carry out attacks its own people, as well as other military targets, and blame it on the Cuban government, so that the U.S. would have a justified reason for going to war with Cuba. The plan involved blowing up U.S. ships and even inciting acts of terrorism on the streets of America, killing civilians. It was backed by the Duty and Joint Chiefs of Staff. Thankfully, John Kennedy vetoed the idea. According to Adam Walensky, JFK's speechwriter and friend at the time, JFK left the meeting and said, "And we call ourselves the human race." Edit. Changed RFK to JFK, because I'm a dumbus. Also, I get it dudes. 9/11 was an inside job. Edit 2. My first gold. Thank you so much, kind stranger. Not sure if it's declassified, but the case of Hisashi Aochi. He was a Japanese nuclear plant worker who was exposed to a lot of radiation which left him looking like a fallout gal. They kept him alive for 3 months, even though he was in a lot of pain. His heart even stopped 3 times in an hour, but they kept on resuscitating him. I don't know much about it, but it is interesting to read about. After the Male Massacre, killing of around 400 to 500 innocent civilians in Vietnam after an army troop killed an entire village, the U.S. government established a group to investigate other war crimes like this occurring in Vietnam, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They found 28 massacres of equal or greater magnitude than My Lai that the public was unaware of, so literally thousands of innocent people killed by U.S. soldiers. The information has since been reclassified, but there were several journal articles on it when it was first released. Not sure if it's creepy, but certainly disturbing. Edit. Here's a link to an article about it by the LA Times from when it was originally declassified, if anyone is interested. La Times. Com Newslana Vietnam, the 6th of August 2006 story. HTML. I remembered the details wrong. It was 7 larger scale massacres and 203 reported events of war crimes, murder of civilians, torture, etc. The article goes into more detail. A man named Joseph McMoneagle claimed he had the unusual talent known as remote viewing, where he had the ability to see the world through another person's eyes at any physical place and any place in time. The CIA ran a test on him in 1984 where they tried to discredit his ability. They gave him a piece of paper with coordinates and a date in time written on it, and told him to tell them what he saw. The catch was the coordinates were on Mars and the date was 1,000,000 years in the past. However, to their surprise, when McMoneagle began to describe what he saw, he described an unfamiliar landscape and said that he viewed a civilization in dire state. He then went on to describe complex infrastructure spanning the strange landscape, such as roads, aqueducts, channels and pyramids. He described the entities that he saw as tall shadowed figures, and it appeared that their situation was critical and on the brink of apocalypse. The CIA declassified the entire transcript, which can be read by anyone online. CIA. Gov Library Reading Room Document Jar DP 96-00788 R001900760001-9. Albert Fish was a serial killer based in New York. He claims to have murdered 100 plus children, but was convicted and executed for 5. He wrote a letter to the mother of a 10-year-old girl that he cannibalized in 1928. The letter is one of the most demented things I have ever read. http viral nova comfish letter. Pretty much anything related to Mary Curie. Wikipedia. Org Wiki. Mary Curie. She discovered radium, coining the term radioactivity, and suffered greatly for it. There's lots of documentation on how horribly she died, including her own testimony to the first-hand experience of radiation poisoning. Soviet Union's Cannibal Island Wikipedia, org Wiki Nazinova. In the 1930s, the Soviet government decided to send thousands of undesirables to a swampy river island called Nazino with nothing to survive on but bags of flour. People tried mixing the flour with river water and this resulted in outbreaks of dysentery. Eventually people started eating corpses and later on killing other people for food. There was no leaving the island, since the guards would shoot you if you tried. Eventually the settlement was dissolved and the 2,800 plus survivors were sent to smaller settlements upstream. All of this was kept secret by the government until 1988, when the glasnost policy was introduced and the details were made public. The Snowden documents. Why is it the most dug up? Because nothing came of it. People are still being spied on today and it's not even seen as that bad. That's why it's dug up. Operation Marauder, the US military's attempt to create a functional plasma weapon in the early 90s. After successful early experiments, the results were classified and nothing's been published since 1995. Wikipedia, org Wiki Marauder. Nuremberg trials transcripts. The trials of medical personnel were particularly bad. One example, they were trying to make poison bullets. To test them, they would select Russian POWs and shoot them in the hip with a rifle. To be scientific, they had controls. So, they'd shoot one guy with a regular bullet and a couple with poison bullets, then watch them, making medical observations the entire time, to see how long it took them to die. Edit. Also look up the documents on Japanese Unit 731 in China. Then find the unclassified documents on what the Allies did with the doctors that participated in Unit 731. The good old days weren't so great. Pedro Albizu Campos was arrested a third time and imprisoned for 26 years for working to make Puerto Rico independent by the American government. The cause was that members of the Nationalist Party shot in Congress and unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, illegal to do at the time. He wasn't there, but he was the head of the Nationalist Party and the American government had been keeping an eye on him for years. While in prison his health deteriorated, and he said that they were using radiation to kill him in his cells. No one believed him until folders used by the American government to keep tabs on the Puerto Rican people were declassified in the late 90s. There it was found that they were using radiation to kill him, and him, being as smart as he was, tried to slow the poisoning slowly by covering himself with wet towels, getting the nickname King of the Towels by his jailers. That's just one of the many crimes Americans have done against the Puerto Rican people, all public now, when these documents were declassified. The CIA were informed that Hitler was hiding out in South America in the 50s and thought it credible enough they investigated. There's even a photograph of the suspected Hitler with the principal source of information, CIA. GovLibra Iriding Groom Docs HITLER% to C%20 Adelph 0003. PDF. Warning edit. People are claiming it automatically downloads a PDF from the CIA's website, which wasn't my experience, but I thought I'd put a warning here. Who was also a former member of the SS, that believed the Allies couldn't prosecute Hitler for war crimes because it had been too long. The findings in the Rees Committee that state the deliberate dumbing down of the US population in the Dodd report to the Rees Committee on Foundations. He gave a definition of the word subversive, saying that the term referred to any action having as its purpose the alteration of either the principle or the form of the United States government by other than constitutional means. He then argued that the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Carnegie Endowment were using funds excessively on projects at Columbia, Harvard, Chicago University and the University of California in order to enable oligarchical collectivism. He stated, the purported deterioration in scholarship and in the techniques of teaching which, lately, has attracted the attention of the American public, has apparently been caused primarily by a premature effort to reduce our meager knowledge of social phenomena to the level of an applied science. Culture was pretty ducked up. CIA created mind control program that tried a bunch of different things to control behavior in people, paid people to be LSD test subjects by picking them off street and paying them in cocaine. just to leave for them dead after, among other stuff. Unabomber was a test subject, and it ducked him up, and lead to him killing people. Also, the author of One Flight Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a test subject. Bet y'all have not heard of this one. The Mandorbiting Laboratory was an Air Force project back during the Cold War. Its stated goal was to test the effectiveness of space-based recon. Its hidden agenda was to test the applications of an orbital weapons station. Not only that, it would have been used for global surveillance, including Americans. The government has been plotting to spy on us for over 50 years. Luckily, it was cancelled to fund the Vietnam War and was the military's last chance to develop a space program. http nro gov/adiclasmol html. In East Germany, the Stasi collected absurd amounts of information about civilians, later available at the Stasi Records Agency. There was even an archive of people's scents with impregnated cloths. You can visit the museum in Berlin. Recommended. Watch the film The Lives of Others, Das Leben der Anderen, depicting exactly this. The Aversion Project. Evils of homophobia at its absolute worst. In the 1970 ATS, South Africa forced lesbian and gay soldiers to undergo exchange operations, chemical castration, electric shock, and other unethical medical experiments. An estimated 900 forced sexual reassignment operations may have been performed between 1971 and 1989 at military hospitals as part of a top-secret program to root out homosexuality from the service. Those who could not be cured with drugs, aversion shock therapy, hormone treatment, and other radical psychiatric means were chemically castrated or given sex-change operations. The Guardian. Comworld 2000 Jul 29 Chris McGreal. Operation Northwoods Wikipedia. Wiki Operation Northwoods is pretty ducked up and creepy if you consider the implications. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation against the Cuban government that originated within the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, or other U.S. government operatives to commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets, blaming it on the Cuban government and using it to justify a war against Cuba. The plans detailed in the document included the possible assassination of Cuban émigrés, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating violent terrorism in U.S. cities. The proposals were rejected by the Kennedy administration. 3. The fact that this ever even made it to the desk of the President of the United States is honestly revolting.